I'm Jonathan Watt with the Tara Group International. We hope you're enjoying our material, and if you are and would like to support our ministry, please press the like button and subscribe to our channel. We're doing a church history series again and have been talking about various aspects of the Holy Week known ultimately leading up to Easter. I want to talk specifically here about the celebration of Maundy Thursday in the Christian church, how that came about and how it got the name that it did. Within the sacred rhythm of what is traditionally called Holy Week, the day known as Maundy Thursday holds deep theological but also historical significance for many Christians around the world. Now, it's observed obviously on the Thursday just before Easter, and it's a day that commemorates the final evening Jesus Christ spent with his disciples leading up to his crucifixion. And it remembers several profound events together, including the Last Supper, the institution of the Eucharist, and Jesus' dramatic act of humility in washing the feet of his own disciples. Now, while these biblical events are familiar to many Christians today, the development of Maundy Thursday as a liturgical celebration in the church emerged gradually over centuries. The traditions associated with this day reveal as well how early Christians sought to remember Christ's command to love, serve, and sacrifice themselves for one another. And central to this remembrance is the recognition that the Last Supper itself was originally a celebration of the Jewish festival of Passover, and understanding this connection helps illuminate the meaning behind Maundy Thursday in Christian faith and historical practice. Let's start with some of the biblical foundations and see where it all begins. The origins of Maundy Thursday lie in the gospel accounts, as I think you're getting used to hearing here, describing Jesus' final meal with his disciples. And according to the New Testament, on the night before his crucifixion, Jesus gathered with the 12 apostles in Jerusalem specifically to celebrate the Jewish Passover meal, celebrated annually, roughly in late winter, early springtime. During this gathering, he broke bread, shared wine with them, parts of the regular elements of that meal, and then said, "This is my body and this is my blood." He gave it new meaning and established what would become the central sacrament of Christian worship. You can read more about it, for example, in Luke chapter 22, but also in Paul's epistle to the 1 Corinthians epistle, chapter 11. Now, the Gospel of John highlights another powerful detail connected with this time. Jesus washed the feet of his disciples, an act typically performed by servants. And so after doing so, he then instructed them to follow his example of humble service. And you can read about this in the Gospel of John, chapter 13. Now, this moment provided the theological foundation for what would come to be known as Maundy Thursday and the traditions going with it, which focused on humility and also what we call servant leadership. So the word Maundy itself comes from a Latin term mandatum or mandatum, meaning a command. Gives our word today the mandate. It refers to Jesus' statement in John chapter 13, verse 34, where he says, "A new commandment I give you, love one another." So the command became central to the identity and meaning of the day, as well as a marker of the Christian life. Now, let's remember here the Passover roots of the Last Supper. To fully understand Maundy Thursday, it's important to recognize the Jewish context of the Last Supper. The meal Jesus shared with his disciples was connected to the annual celebration of the Passover, one of the most significant festivals historically in Judaism then and now. Passover commemorates the liberation of the Israelites from slavery in Egypt well more than 3,000 years ago, and as described in the book of Exodus. Now, during the Passover meal, Jewish families traditionally tend to recall God's deliverance using symbolic foods, prayers, and storytelling. The eating of bread without yeast is also involved, known as unleavened bread, and it recalls the haste with which the Israelites were said to have fled Egypt. A quick bake and then get out of there. The wine represents a celebration in God's covenant with the people of Israel. The entire meal is structured around remembering God's saving acts in history. When Jesus gathered with his disciples for the Passover meal, he gave these traditional symbols a new meaning. So by identifying the bread, which was already part of the meal, with his own body, and the cup of wine, also part of the meal, but now with his own blood, he connected the ancient story of liberation from Egypt with the new covenant he was establishing through his own sacrifice. So in that sense, Christians could understand the Last Supper as a transformative moment in which the Passover story was being fulfilled and then reinterpreted and reapplied to the life and the mission of Jesus Christ. Now, for early Christians, many of whom were Jewish, the connection between Passover and the Last Supper was deeply meaningful. Just as God had delivered Israel from bondage, they believed Jesus' death and resurrection would bring deliverance from sin and spiritual bondage, and thus the Eucharist became both a continuation of the Passover tradition and simultaneously it was becoming a distinctly Christian sacrament centered now on Christ's redemptive sacrifice and work. So early Christian observance tells us this. The earliest Christians were remembering the events of the Last Supper whenever they gathered for the Eucharist. However, as the church calendar developed, specific commemorations were focused around Holy Week, and these were starting to emerge in various places. So by the 4th century, Christians in Jerusalem, for example, were marking the events leading up to the crucifixion with special liturgical services. And an early pilgrim to the Middle East named Egeria, who traveled to Jerusalem in the late 4th century, recorded detailed descriptions of Holy Week worship events that she observed there in her travel diary. And there she describes how the believers would gather at various locations associated with the final days of Jesus' life. And on Thursday evening, they would commemorate the Last Supper and the events that followed, including Jesus' prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane. So these early commemorations combine scripture readings, prayer, and communal reflection, and then over time, they become more formalized within the liturgical traditions of many churches, East and West. Now, the development of Maundy Thursday rituals was like this. During the medieval period, Maundy Thursday developed several distinctive liturgical elements that remain part of Christian worship for many today. One of the most important was what Roman Catholics called the Mass of the Lord's Supper, which commemorates and in a sense reenacts the institution of the Eucharist. In Western Christian traditions, the service became the central liturgy of the day, emphasizing Christ's sacrifice and the ongoing presence of Christ in the sacramental life of the church and those who recognized and welcomed this adoration. Another key practice was the foot washing ceremony, often called the mandatum or mandatum. During this ritual, clergy sometimes would wash the feet of selected members of the congregation, symbolizing Christ's act of humility toward his disciples. And the practice would come to serve as a vivid reminder that Christian leadership must be rooted in service rather than power. Now, medieval churches often incorporated acts of charity into Maundy Thursday observances. So in some regions, for example, church leaders would distribute food, clothing, or even money to the poor, reflecting Jesus' command to love and serve others in a manner as he had done as well. Now, there was a Royal Maundy and acts of charity in England. Maundy Thursday became associated with a unique royal tradition known as Royal Maundy. And beginning in the medieval period, English monarchs would participate in ceremonies that included washing the feet of the poor and distributing gifts or alms. And over time, the foot washing element faded, but the custom of distributing special coins to recipients chosen for their service to the community would continue in some places even to this very day. The practice emphasized the Christian principle that leaders, whether political or religious, are called to care for the vulnerable and the marginalized. So Reformation, liturgical changes, I think you know to expect this. The Protestant Reformation in the 16th century brought significant changes to many church practices, as we have noted, including the observance of Maundy Thursday. Reformers like Martin Luther sought to simplify the liturgy and remove elements they believed lacked clear biblical and overt biblical foundations. And in many Protestant traditions, the emphasis shifted toward preaching, scripture reading, and the celebration of the Lord's Supper on a day like this. Some churches discontinued elaborate rituals, while others retained simplified versions of foot washing and, of course, kept communal worship. Meanwhile, Roman Catholic and Orthodox traditions maintain many of the historic Maundy Thursday liturgies, including the washing of feet and the solemn transfer of the Eucharist to a place of repose, symbolizing Jesus' journey to the Garden of Gethsemane, where ultimately he would be betrayed. Now, contemporary celebrations around the world in many places still echo these kinds of practices. Today, Maundy Thursday continues to be observed by many Christian denominations in the Roman Catholic churches, Orthodox, Anglican, Lutheran, and actually in many Protestant churches as well. And while specific practices vary from place to place, several common themes clearly unite these celebrations. First, we can note many churches hold a service of Holy Communion, remembering the Last Supper and Christ's command to do this in remembrance of me. Second, foot washing ceremonies remain quite common in certain traditions, obviously symbolizing humility and servant leadership. And in some congregations, the service concludes with a so-called stripping of the altar, a ritual in which decorations are actually removed from the sanctuary or place of worship. The act symbolizes the abandonment of Jesus by his disciples and prepares the congregation for the somber remembrance of Good Friday, which is just around the corner the next day. And these practices together were to help worshipers move spiritually from the intimacy of the Last Supper onto the sufferings and the sacrifice that were shortly to follow. So to this day, Maundy Thursday carries several powerful theological themes that have shaped Christian spirituality, you can see clearly, for centuries by this time. First, it highlights the institution of the Eucharist, which remains central to Christian worship and to communal identity. The sharing of bread and wine symbolizes unity with Christ and with fellow believers of past generations and around the world today. Second, the washing of feet demonstrates the radical humility of Jesus himself. And in a society structured by hierarchy and status, Christ reversed expectations by serving his disciples. The act challenges Christians to reconsider their understanding of leadership and authority and service. So finally, Maundy Thursday emphasizes the command to love one another. The day's name itself reminds believers that faith is not only about doctrine and thoughts and perceptions, but also about embodying your very life Christ's love through acts of compassion and service. And this connection with Passover also reminds Christians that their faith is rooted in a broader story of divine deliverance. Just as God freed Israel from slavery in ancient times, Christians believe Christ's sacrifice brings spiritual liberation and permits reconciliation with God. So please join the conversation. This history of Maundy Thursday reveals how Christian communities across the centuries have sought to remember and embody the teachings of Jesus during Holy Week. And while other traditions or moments in church history are out there, we'd like to ask you, what would you like us to explore? Are there particular practices, historical figures, or theological developments that interest you that you would like us to explore and spend some time with? We invite you to share your thoughts and suggestions in the comments section below so together we can continue uncovering the rich and the fascinating history of the Christian church together. Atara Group International is about supporting leadership and ministry. And if your church or nonprofit organization or ministry is seeking support in strengthening leadership, planning impactful programs, or developing resources for growth, Atara Group International offers personal, professional expertise and guidance, and our services include leadership and staff training, help with grant writing, keynote speakers, providing those for a conference, retreat, and also leadership conference opportunities in any way we can, helping organizations to develop strong teams and expand their vision and increase the impact in the communities that we serve together.